A key aspect of any suburb is its supporting network of streets, public and commercial spaces and community facilities, that all of which really ought to be able to be walked to. So easily overlooked are the public spaces of community: the swimming pool, the football ground, the kindergarten, the baby healthcare centre, the local library. This is Brisbane's Centenary Pool. These are the spaces most at risk in existing suburbia, with the rush to rationalise, centralise and, in effect, demand access only by motorcar. What new community on our outs and our fringes boasts such facilities? Where are the new tennis clubs, the new bowling clubs, the new local soccer field, or even the outdoor futsal pitch? That's indoor soccer. The outdoor futsal pitch, which needs only to be the size of a double garage. Why are we losing most of our public outdoor swimming pools, iconic places of socialisation and gathering? The key location in all of this, though, is the local school. It needs to be the starting point of any suburban plan. We should not start with the house, we should start with the school, which is going to be the focus of any community. In 1920, American planner Clarence Perry designated the school as the starting point for the design of any neighbourhood unit, hence community. The key was a 5-minute walk for children to their elementary school. New and existing primary and secondary schools need to be rethought as new community nodes, places where open space is sacrosanct, places also where the idea and culture of a productive landscape, as Peter mentioned, might be fostered. Last year I ran a studio with 15 Masters of Architecture students in the Melbourne School of Design, and our brief was to work in collaboration with Stephanie Alexander's Kitchen Garden Foundation and design a prototype prefabricated kitchen classroom that was sustainable in material choice, the collection of rainwater and use of energy, and it might be dropped into any school across Victoria. This project, for example, by Rob Chittleborough, involved a series of water-collecting roofs atop very ordinary, inexpensive timber box forms. Another, by Katja Pelicano, uses a repetitive steel frame and a parasol roof to reduce thermal gain. The compelling aspect of all of the student projects was the whole idea of a holistic approach to education, design and climate change, a thoroughly integrated way of promoting cultural change at grassroots level and with children and the next generation. In 2010, it will be 50 years since the publication of Robin Boyd's The Australian Ugliness. In that book, Boyd coined the two terms featureism, and I love this one, arborophobia. Featureism, the camouflaging of buildings with superfluous decoration, has been much studied and the coals of taste raked over again and again. But arborophobia, the suburban hatred, as Boyd saw it, of trees, hasn't left us. Indeed, it's still with us. It's alarming. Indeed, the role of trees in the suburbs needs new attention, not just as street trees, but as critical elements that might not only assist in providing shade, amenity and shelter for wildlife, but also to act as productive elements of the suburban landscape. And whatever happened to the mandatory lemon tree in everyone's garden? And what about thinking about a new type of suburban orchard? The suburban landscape can be reimagined in terms of density, infrastructure, especially water and landscape. And we need to look beyond the trappings of style, which Boyd focused on, and ask other questions that relate to design but suggest fundamental rethinking of a whole range of parameters. Subdivision. Can we propose new block and street layouts that suggest a new range of housing typologies and affordable alternatives? Water. Let's legislate for residential water tanks and think more creatively how we might include the collection of water into domestic design. Space. Can we build in the spaces between two houses like these? What are the limits? Can we do this legally? And what are the barriers to overcome legislation in terms of making innovation? What are the sacrifices that we might have to make in terms of amenity? And there might need to be some sacrifices made. Solutions, I would argue, have to come through design and collaboration with a willing community to change. And that's hard. Finally, I finish again on another Howard Arkley painting. House and Garden, Western Suburbs, Melbourne, it's called, 1988. It's vibrant, colourful and full of life, as well as angst and alienation. You can't do without. And it is the space of the greatest challenge for the future of the Australian city, to reimagine these everyday landscapes as sustainable and productive, and in the minds of the community, resilient rather than vulnerable. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Philip. On a very personal note, that first slide you started with, it reminded me of my very first job with the Urban Renewal Authority here in Victoria well over 30 years ago. So it was interesting to see that. And one of the things that I personally drew out as well was the need to rethink at that design level. And as a long-time property lawyer, I think it's really interesting that you mentioned the need for legal change. And when I think that the standard block has its, and the property concept goes back to the 11th century in the UK, then perhaps it is time for some change. And I think this was a wonderful talk to stimulate those ideas. And so thank you. And I'd like to now turn to our third speaker, who is going to pick up some of these themes, but to give us an idea of the continuity of the suburb and how the historical experiences of Australia can be brought to bear on this question of cultural change. And so it's with pleasure that I turn to our third speaker, Associate Professor Andrew May. And he's an urban historian in the School of Historical Studies here at the university. He was the director of the Encyclopedia of Melbourne project and supervised its publication for a number of years. He's applied history in a number of contexts, very on-the-ground Melbourne pod tours with the ABC, and his first book, Melbourne Street Life, explored long-forgotten aspects of the 19th century public culture here in Melbourne. He also has a range of other publications that celebrate urban and suburban life. And as well as these publications, he brings a standing as sitting on a number of advisory committees, and these are important institutions within Victoria. So, for example, the National Trust, the Public Record Office for Victoria, Heritage Victoria, the State Library, the Melbourne Immigration Museum, amongst others. So there's a wealth of advice to our central institutions that Andrew is providing. In particular, more recently, the Encyclopedia of Melbourne won the 2007 Victorian Community and Local Government Award for the Best Collaborative Community Work. So there's an engagement with the community that's very important in his work and professional life. So thank you, Andrew.
Thank you for that kind introduction. I'm going to take my role this afternoon as a bit of an opportunity to reflect and expand, I think, on the cultural meanings of suburbia, and therefore, I hope too, on some of the possibilities for cultural change, and on top of the types of sort of institutional and spatial changes that Peter and Philip have suggested. How do we create in the suburbs centres of interest, excellence and exchange? How do we make them productive? How do we give them a touch of urbanity? And in those sort of that rubric we've got for this session, sort of implicitly, I think, is a kind of a negative view, a negative appraisal, if you like, of our inherited culture of suburbia, which are, in fact, and have been for a very long time historically, our typical and ubiquitous haunt. So is this kind of line of questioning about the suburbs a kind of a hackneyed one? Does it perpetuate sort of stereotypes of monotony and disengagement and so forth? We could alternatively ask, is the suburb, as our characteristic habitat, is it not already productive in many ways? Are the suburbs really lacking in urbanity? And what do we mean by that? Now, I think some of the kind of radical solutions that we're opening up, radical challenges, certainly demand some really radical rethinking. But I think they also demand of us that we do examine our histories, we reframe our assumptions if you like, about the past that we've inherited in order to make these sort of decisions about the future. And perhaps in doing so, some of the solutions that we're thinking of may not be quite as radical as we think they are, and maybe not quite as difficult as perhaps we perceive them to be. They might more easily fit into a kind of a continuum of solutions of thought and of practice that actually have lineages that go back quite some way in our histories. That said, I think, again, as Philip pointed to, we might also reflect on the types of kind of culture clashes and clashes of practice and expectations that we face when we're trying to modify our behaviours and our expectations about urban and suburban living. We could locate the suburban past in myriad places. At various times in our history, it's been the product of both push factors and pull factors, of appeal and revulsion, of the perceived delights of a retreat to some kind of semi-rural idyll, and the rejection of a perceived inner-city blight and inner-city decay, particularly in the immediate post-war years. Australia has perhaps rightly been touted as the first suburban nation, and has always been very self-consciously so. Our original suburbs date from the early decades of the 19th century, when that suburban ideal was the dominant ideology in Britain, founded on notions of domestic privacy, of bourgeois conservatism and conformity, of religious virtue, the home as the kind of sanctuary, on sanitary and environmental kind of wholesomeness. Of course, railway growth from the 1880s particularly, and the motor car from the post-1950s led that kind of outer suburban expansion. The crash of the 1890s and the demise of those great land boomers of the 1880s perhaps also marked the kind of roots of some of that anti-suburban sentiment that we've also already mentioned. And that was nourished too by other international trends, by scepticism for suburbia that was being promulgated in Britain, for example, by H.G. Wells and other authors in the early decades of the 20th century. Was the suburb a retreat from the city, or was it a retreat from life itself? Now, this image of the suburb of the past, if you like, represented on the cover of Australian Home Beautiful in December 1953, with that sign saying "To Better Living," captures in freeze frame, I think, some of these tensions and aspirations at a critical period of the suburb's development. Over the post-war period, a massive period of transition that it was, saw this suburban frontier expand and consolidate. Both conservative and radical critics alike have constructed the suburb at different times as a bastion of conformity, where a generation of Australian intellectuals perhaps despised suburbia for its perceived mediocrity and conformity. Robert Menzies, for example, placed the suburban home squarely in the forefront of Liberal Party ideology in the 1940s. I quote, "That one little piece of earth with a house and garden which is ours, to which we can withdraw, in which we can be amongst our friends, and into which no stranger can come against our will." Now, it's through interviewing suburban pioneers, as numbers of historians call them, historians such as Graham Davison and John Murphy and others, have started to kind of revise the sneering and patronising view of the suburbs, and instead asserting a place through these decades where men and women were living much more complex and nuanced lives, where the meanings of public and private, of home and domesticity, isolation, freedom, progress, triumphing over adversity, were all experienced in very real and different ways. And the suburbs of our histories are places that are brimful of meaning and expectation for everyday people. These sorts of intimate social and cultural histories of Australia, and Australian suburbia particularly, are still really crying out to be resurrected and written. But the headline history of suburbia is still, I think, very much derived from the twin fictions of the novelist's pen, and perhaps to a great extent too by a kind of baby boomer nostalgia about the suburb that we've seen particularly from the 1990s. Now, a lot of the novelist's caricatures of the suburb are drawn with specific purposes and premises in mind. on the cusp of the 1950s, for example. Socialist writer John Morrison's 1949 novel, The Creeping City, suspiciously viewed Melbourne creeping out towards the Dandenongs as this kind of conformist, upstart, upper-class city marching out, where wattles were replaced by roses in gardens, and I quote, that succumbed to the tractable paraphernalia of Toorak and South Yarra. So this kind of suburb as a contested cultural domain is quite clear. There's no doubt that this sense of the creeping city was very contested as these older, more rural areas were succumbing to residential incursion, the fruit and the flower growing districts and the agricultural districts of the 1940s becoming the suburban villages of the 1950s. And this is where Boyd's agoraphobes, of course, fit in. So this creeping city of Morrison resonates with tension, resentment, the city versus the country, the wealthy suburban newcomers invading a land that's already been claimed by a previous generation of residents and settlers, the street imposed on the bush, Indigenous flora supplanted by exotic. And by implication, that new suburbanite was superficial and self-possessed, preferring to clean the slate and favouring a standardisation of landscape. While popular imagery of suburbia is often negative, individual suburbanites will consistently affirm the positive aspects of their lifestyle in everyday ways. Much of the physical and institutional landscape of the post-war suburb is the legacy of that immediate post-war idealism, galvanised by the pursuit of common goals, inspired by post-war dreams of privacy, home ownership, and a better environment to bring up a new generation. And the stories those pioneer suburbanites will tell you about the way they battled to make good on that suburban frontier comprise a great foundation mythology and story. The suburb is made much more complex if we observe the ways that people empower their own memories in reminiscence about exactly what's happened. With a gleam in their eye, they'll tell you their personal histories, how they killed 5 snakes digging in the driveway, how they used to burn Kero and sump oil in the gutters to get rid of the mosquitoes, how women pushed their prams for miles along rutted, unmade roads to get to the shops, how men who've never been handy in their lives suddenly turned their hand to all manner of tasks. The legitimacy of this suburb might be vouched for in more positive ways, turning the uncertainties and the mistakes of the past into future prospects and possibilities. The boom middle suburbs that experienced their demographic peaks in the 60s and 1970s were, perhaps by the start of this century, being spurned for cheaper land on the urban fringe or the apparent convenience and cosmopolitan delight of the inner city. But these discomforting and unrewarding stereotypes of suburbia are still very much naggingly lodged in our everyday consciousness. Suburbia can still be characterised, and is constantly so, and I quote from a recent newspaper, as synonymous with blandness, row upon row of cooker-cutty houses along identical streets in neighbourhoods seemingly devoid of anything interesting to see or do. So that black and white stereotype of suburbia still haunts the way we see the city in the present. And we also need to be on the watch for these kind of sepia-toned elements of nostalgia. While suburbia is, on the one hand, the focus of a kind of intellectual scorn, on the other, it also can be represented as a very idealised place, replete with innocent and familiar and comfortable images. The 50s very much became retro in the 90s, defended against fashionable criticisms for their blandness. As Janet McCalman, the historian, has pointed out, the tropes of the baby boomers are backyards in Melbourne, the beach in Sydney, hills hoists, Holden cars, mums in the kitchen, dads in the tool shed, grandma still in the inner suburbs where real life goes on. The nostalgic version of the suburb has it as the way it ought to be, clean, quiet, natural, domestic places. It was a time, supposedly, when you could leave the front door open on a hot night, when daughters could walk home late at night, safe and unmolested. So again, I think we need to account in our analyses for the role of nostalgia in forming our understandings of suburban and community life. Some aspects have been lost because they never existed. Some have been lost because they were probably worth losing. Some now take place in other locations, in virtual spaces, and some are still with us. Suburban histories can recover these moments when individuals look ahead, perched, unsure and self-consciously on the threshold between past and future, themselves sometimes nostalgic for an idealised past. As she stood on Doncaster Hill in the mid-1950s, Jean Field, the writer, looked ahead and looked behind. In the face of what she saw as the rampant materialism and greed of land speculators and developers, she questioned the uniformity of building design, the homogenous physical and moral direction of Melbourne's sprawl. We might profit today, she wrote, if we could bring ourselves to shed some of the luxuries of modern living and return to the simple things once again. But that post-war suburban push was irrepressible. Land was cheaper, more available. And as the Argus newspaper trumpeted in May 1950, the air is fresher out there and it's a good place to raise a family, away from the heavy traffic and the congested shopping areas. It's healthier, the young mothers will tell you. In fact, for the first few weeks, you'll find yourself eating like a horse. Now, I love this image of Cole's New World. I think it's in North Balwyn, perhaps around 1960. It's a picture from the past, but it tells us something about the way we've tended to look to the future for confidence, for ideas, for inspiration. It's an image too, perhaps, that looks very dated. How much the world has changed since car parking spaces for 300 and automatically opening doors were a novelty. We can't plan the future, that is, we can't anticipate the things that we don't know about it. Historian Mark Peel has noted in his History of Elizabeth in South Australia, historians of Australian planning tend to stress the powerlessness of the reformers and the visionaries. Their characters limp rather forlornly across a landscape of torn-up plans and broken designs, able to deflect but never to finally shape the form of Australian cities. When we look at this past, we often regretfully say, why didn't we? But I don't think in any way that means that we shouldn't still be looking to the future and still asking, why can't we do different things? My last picture is about the suburb imagined. We're forever standing by this backyard fence, either straining to catch a glimpse through the spy hole into the past or looking through the crack into the future. Can we first feel at home in the suburbia that we've inherited? Can the suburb be more comfortable with its past? Can we see a future less as a community of exclusion than an interactive and sustainable human setting? The experiences of individual suburban residents, pioneers and their inheritors, mistrusted by intellectual elites, need in some respects to find new legitimacy. To redeem the suburb, which I take to mean to reclaim it, to get it back, to rescue it, to reimagine it, firstly it means, I think, to recognise it, to admit that we're actually at home in it, to feel at home in it, to perhaps even feel proud of it. Our own imagination of what it can become needs to be shaped by an understanding of what it's actually been. Everyday experiences of social life might be analysed in terms of change and transformation rather than as decline. In thinking about what Peter's called the edible landscape, we can learn, as he mentions, from Andrea Gaynor's work on the way that suburban residents have, in fact, had a very strong and rich history of growing food. An assumed loss of community in contemporary suburban life, a loss of social capital, is much characterised by suburban critics. But these stereotypes ignore the suburb's historical and future capacity to accommodate cultural change. And many historians are now starting to look at the history of the suburbs as sites of engagement rather than detachment through the 1950s and beyond. With the opening in late 1956 of the Café Hava in the Midway Arcade in Ringwood, replete with a new espresso coffee machine and continental cakes, the Ringwood Mail could proudly assert that the march of progress charged through Ringwood in 7-leg boots. There's a top of Collins Street air about its shops, offices and little salons, which for colour, design and contemporary fixings would be hard to beat. What is urbanity? The quality of being urbane, civilised, townish, refined, cultured? It is simplistic to think it's about whether you can get a cafe latte or not. It's been argued that the imposition of conformity by the few on the many leads to a denial of social and environmental diversity. This pressure to conform is the kind of key motif of suburbia. But if I've made one point this afternoon, it's to say that the instinct to contest, to innovate and adapt is very much the liberating corollary of suburbia. Don't be one of these, chided the Argus in 1950, the man who refuses to cut his nature strip so it stands as an untidy blot in an otherwise trim street, who allows weeds to grow and garden rubbish to accumulate in his backyard, who plants one of those annoying trees or hedges which scatter their seeds all over the neighbourhood, who covers the dividing fence with an untidy creeper, or worst of all, keeps fowls and allows them to stray next door. Yet there's always slippage between the protocol and the practice. Looking back on 2009 from the future, we might easily presume that all motorists travel at 50 kilometres an hour in local streets, which they don't. In the same way, the observer of the suburbs should be alert to all manner of subversions and of any presumed suburban monotony and standardisation. Changes in attitudes and behaviour can be read over long periods of time, with a greater eye for why particular issues are important at different times. The planting of nature strips with native grasses was an untidy blot on the landscape in the 1950s, certainly decried as a weed heap and a fire hazard up to the 1980s and 90s. But perhaps that sort of practice is becoming much more de rigueur in the 21st century. Peter mentioned the importance of federal government regulatory intervention. I think so much about the landscape, the localised landscape of suburbs, is also invigilated by a regulatory regime of local government that's very much inherited from those immediate post-war years that reacted against these perceived evils of obstruction and diversity and noise and so on. So like Scrooge in Dickens' A Christmas Carol, who undergoes a profound process of redemption, we should be haunted by these ghosts of the past, the present, as well as the future yet to come, if we are to redeem the suburb and the city. Thank you.